News. All right, we've been having some interesting discussions here in the case for the Bible in the postmodern world. Hope today will be a blessing to you. Brother Ben Moss, there he comes. See, he's the one on trial here. He's been telling me about, why don't you talk about all the historical stuff that supports the Bible? And today we're going to actually start doing that. And I think you'll enjoy it. So our question for today is, are the Gospels credible witnesses for the life of Jesus? Can we really depend on the Gospels? Now, giving you some background here, if you've been through some of these classes we've been having, the postmodern view is that the Bible is a book of mythology, and it's not to be trusted, especially when we talk about supernatural things. It is a book that arises out of Judeo-Christian culture, like other books that arise out of other cultures. And it's filled with some things that are true and some things that are not true, especially the miracle stuff, the supernatural stuff. So why should we believe the Gospels, basically, today? Many years ago when I was in graduate school, the big craze in world theological studies was the historical Jesus, what they called the historical Jesus. The idea was that since we don't believe in the supernatural, then the real Jesus, the historical Jesus, must be different than the Jesus who actually lived in the Gospels. See? Because the Jesus that we see in the Gospels is a larger than life superhero. I mean, he does all kinds of things that normal people can't do. So the question has been asked and asked numerous times, who was this mysterious figure that has inspired so much discussion and controversy for the last 2,000 years? See, who was this Jesus that the Gospels talk about? When you really look at this with open eyes, on the left you have the documents that support Jesus A. Jesus A is the Jesus that you actually read about in the Gospels. That manuscript that you see there is one of the Martin Bodmer papyri, dates around 200 AD, less than 100 years after John's death. And it tells the story of Jesus as we have in our Gospels, of the miracle-working Jesus, of the virgin-born Jesus, of the raised from the dead Jesus. It tells this story. Now, this is an actual ancient document, and we'll show later that the New Testament documents are actual first century documents, written in Greek, okay? Albert Schweitzer, on the other hand, on the other side, wrote in 1906, and a later theologian, James Robinson, wrote the introduction to this new publication of that book. But Schweitzer says, and we pointed this out in an earlier class, the Jesus of Nazareth who came forth publicly as Messiah, he's talking about the Jesus that we read about in the Gospels, who preached the ethic of the kingdom of God, who founded the kingdom of heaven on earth and died to give his work its final consecration, never had any existence. So you have the Jesus that's presented in the actual Gospels, and you have the Jesus that modern liberal theologians believe in, and those are not the same at all. One is stripped of the supernatural. So to chart this out as we commonly looked at it back in the day, the historical Jesus, Brother Moss, that's their term, not mine. That is the non-supernatural Jesus. He's different, they say, than the Christ of faith. Are these two really different? The Jesus we believe in, is that different than the Jesus that really lived? So that brings us to this question. Is the Jesus story, the one we read about in the actual biblical Gospels, a true story? Is it just a story, or is it a true story? So let's look outside of the Bible for a little bit. We're also going to look inside the Bible. But before we look outside the Bible, let me show you something real quick. Turn to Luke chapter 2. We won't spend much time on this. but I think Luke particularly and others have some of these that are quite interesting to me. Luke chapter 2, verse 1, this is the story of the birth of Jesus. It came about in those days that a decree went forth from Caesar Augustus. Now, Caesar Augustus is a real guy. Roman records show him, and he ended his rule in AD 14. AD 14 is when Tiberius became Caesar. So Jesus was born, says Caesar Augustus, and it says that a census should be taken throughout the whole world. This census was the first one that was done while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now, Quirinius, we all also find in Roman records. So this is a pretty precise date, location here, pretty real, pretty hard historical stuff. It's during the governorship of Quirinius, who was governor of Syria, all Syria, not just Palestine, but Syria, and during the emperorship of Caesar Augustus. So those things overlap. You can corral a period of it happened between here and here, a date. But let me show you over in Luke chapter 3. Luke chapter 3. Luke starts, he's talking about when John the Baptist was preaching and Jesus was 30 years old, about to be baptized. It came about in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Now, Tiberius became the emperor in AD 14. 14 plus 15 is what? 29. See? And then he narrows it down even further. He says, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, well, Pontius Pilate became governor of Judea after Valerius Gratus. That was in AD 26, and he ruled until AD 36. And it seems to me that AD 29 is between 26 and 36, doesn't it to you? Okay, this is pretty weird for a mythological document. You understand what I'm saying? This kind of precision. He then goes on to say, when Herod was tetrarch of Galilee. Now, during that time, after Herod the Great died, there was Herod Antipas, and then there was some of the other parts of Herod's family, Herod Philip, and then there were some of these other guys. But he says, when Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, Philip, his brother, was tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Licinius was tetrarch of Abilene. Now, see, that even narrows it down further when you look into the governorships of those guys that were real guys, actual people. And then he says, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. Well, that's another interesting story. See, this is not like a long time ago in a far-off galaxy. You see what I'm saying? This is so rooted, so tied into actual people, places, and times. Okay? So Annas, the old godfather of the priesthood in Jesus' lifetime, he was actually the high priest from AD 6 to AD 14. But he was a very powerful man, and he oversaw the high priesthood. He was sort of the godfather behind it. Throughout a number of years later, many of his family members became high priests. So in AD 26, Joseph Caiaphas, who was his son-in-law, became the actual high priest and stayed high priest until AD 36, which covers right exactly in the time of Jesus's ministry and death. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read historical documents, other places and other things, I don't hardly ever find anywhere near that kind of precision about when and where we're talking about. Do you? I mean, if you really cogitate on that for a while, that's pretty mind-boggling, precise historical references in both of those cases. All right, so what we're talking about here is the question, is the Jesus story a true story? Are the Gospels credible witnesses? Credible meaning we should believe them. All right, let's look at another outside source. And I meant to bring a little Latin book up here. I've got a little set of red books and a little set of green books. The red books are Latin, the green books are Greek. But in the red books, in Latin, we've got Cornelius Tacitus. Tacitus was a Roman historian that that lived approximately AD 55 to AD 120. Okay, so he lived during the lifetime of John and Paul and all these. And here he's talking about some various things, but let's just look at this passage. There's the reference up there for you. Nero substituted as culprits. He's talking about in Rome and the big fire of Rome, and when Nero crucified a bunch of Christians. Nero substituted as culprits a class of men whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, which is the Greek word for Christ, Christus, the founder of the name, see, the founder of Christianity, had undergone the death penalty, watch it now, in the reign of Tiberius by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. Now, this guy's writing quite a few years after the fact, and he's a Roman historian, and he mentions the same people that the Gospel of Luke mentions. Notice, he died by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate and the pernicious superstition. Now, what does Tacitus think of Christianity? It's a pernicious superstition. It's like weeds that you can't get rid of. It's been around, and we've tried to stamp it out in every possible way we can, but it keeps cropping up everywhere. See? This pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out again, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but also in the capital itself. Now, doesn't the book of Acts show you that Christianity went all the way from Jerusalem to where? To Rome. And it was in the capital, and Paul writes the letter to the Romans, and talks about the church that's in this house and the church that's in that house. So if you really think about that one little citation there, a lot of stuff that the New Testament says is corroborated. Let's say that together. Corroborated. Okay. It's corroborated by some of these outside sources. Okay, Tacitus. Now, look in here, and I should have worked on my slides more and put some stuff in red, but I highlighted Tiberius, and during the reign of Tiberius, the governorship of Pontius Pilate. So a couple of times in the last decade, I went to Israel, as most of you know. And when I was at Caesarea on the coast, which was Pontius Pilate's winter headquarters by the sea. The praetorium, the governmental headquarters of the Roman government, is at Caesarea. All right. So in one of the stones there from the old ancient buildings, you have a Latin inscription. It's partially obliterated, but easy to see what it says. The top that you can't see too well starts with a T, where it's kind of busted there at the top left. Tiberium. Who's that talking about? Tiberius Caesar. All right. And at the bottom left, you have the last two letters of Pontius. That V is in Latin U. Pontius Pilatus. So Pontius Pilatus, reigning as governor under the Emperor Tiberius. Well, that sounds a lot like the Gospel of Luke, but Luke didn't write this. This is in the archaeological records of Caesarea. It's in the stones. See? And we have all kinds of stuff in Acts about Paul became governor. Later, Felix became the governor, then Festus. And there was a king named Herod Agrippa that also had his headquarters at Caesarea. Anybody all remember any of those names from the book of Acts? Okay. Now, this comes from a guy by the name of Flavius Josephus. Flavius Josephus was born in AD 37, and he died in AD 100 approximately. We don't know the exact date of his death. He wrote 22 volume work called The Antiquities of the Jews. He wrote a long work of numerous books called The Jewish Wars, one called The Life, one called Against Apian. But anyway, Josephus, he was a priest. He was a Jew. He ended up being seconded to the Roman army later on. So here's what Josephus writes. Pilate, upon hearing him, that is Jesus, accused by men of the highest standing among us, condemned him to be crucified. All right? Now, in Josephus, he lists, and this is just some of them, I think it's 22 different guys with the name Jesus. See, it was like Jesus's today in Latin America. You could throw a rock and hit one, you know. They were all over. Jesus's were all over the place, okay? Now, he lists a whole bunch of them. He gives them by name, and he also lists among those this Jesus that was called the Christ or the Messiah. Christ is Greek, Messiah is Hebrew. All right? So this is Josephus writing about Jesus. Josephus was not a Christian. Josephus was a Jew. Tacitus was not a Christian. Tacitus was a Roman pagan. He called Christianity a superstition and a disease. Okay, so are these biased toward Christianity sources? Nah. Okay, so about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds, and was a teacher of such people as accept truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks, and he was called the Messiah. And when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, and Josephus was a Jew, so he means the principal Jews are the ones that accused him. That's what the Gospels say, isn't it? Pilate had condemned him to a cross. Those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them on the third day, restored to life. For the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, was still to this day not disappeared. He calls it the tribe of the Christians. Tacitus called it a disease, a pernicious superstition. But all of them say, we can't stamp this thing out. They just keep coming. We keep killing, they keep coming. What's the deal? Now, here are some of the people, some of the independent people and sources. These people are verified. Let me say it the way I'm trying to say it. These people are verified by independent sources that these were real people. Okay? Pontius Pilate was a real guy. Jewish, Roman records support that. Tiberius Caesar, everybody knows he was a real guy. Joseph Caiaphas, they actually have his bones in an ossuary, which is a little case about this big, about the size of this podium. It's about this deep. It's kind of rounded. It's made out of stone. Joseph Caiaphas's bones are in the Israel Museum in an ossuary. Okay, he was a real guy. He was high priest when Jesus was crucified. Gamaliel. I knew I forgot something. I meant to bring my copy of the Mishnah up here to the podium. The Mishnah is a document written in Hebrew that is translated by Herbert Danby into English. The Mishnah contains the teachings of the Pharisees between 200 BC and 200 AD. Among those whose teachings are contained in the Mishnah is Rabbi Gamaliel the Elder, who was one of the most famous rabbis of what they call the Tannaitic period. He was Paul's teacher, remember? Okay, Saul, who was a Pharisee. So you can read the teachings of Rabbi Gamaliel in the Mishnah. He was a real guy. Okay, we've already talked about Augustus. We talk about Herod. Now, Herod is like Owen. My grandpa was Roy H. Owen. My father was George Owen. I'm an Owen. There's some of y'all that are Owens in different ways out there, see? But Herod was a family name, and there were several Herods that the New Testament talks about, not just one. Okay, there's Herod the Great, which was the one at the time of Jesus's birth, Herod Antipas in the Gospels after Herod the Great's death, Herod Agrippa in the book of Acts, several different Herods. Okay, so are these real guys? Well, if you go to Masada and you bother to walk down the side of the mountain into this place that if you turned around the other direction from where Tyler King is standing there, you would look out onto the Judean desert and you could see the Dead Sea out in the distance and everything, and you're way high up on a mountain. But Herod the Great built a palace in the side of the mountain of Masada, and it's really astounding when you walk into this on the side of this mountain. By the way, that boy with his back turned to us, Tyler King, college minister at North MacArthur Church in Oklahoma City, doing great work with the students at OC and Central State University and other people around there. But Herod the Great's palace at Masada. And then if you go at another location in Palestine and you look at this high mountain or tell, it's called Herodium after the Herods. And Herod had a great palace at Herodium. And this is the inside of Herod's palace at Herodium. Herod was a great builder. You know, Herod is the one that helped build the temple in Jerusalem. 46 years it took to build it, see? So Herod the Great is a real deal. I mean, he's a real guy. There's no question if you believe any historical records that he's a real guy. And it's not just a mythical story about somebody like Darth Vader that attacked the baby Jesus and wanted to kill all the baby boys. This was a real guy. He was declared king of the Jews by the Roman Senate in BC, I forgot, 40 or something like that. Joseph Caiaphas, you can actually go to his house on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And it still stands, though most of it above ground is not his, but the below ground stuff is, back to the first century. There's an actual dungeon underneath it, or jail, where Jesus probably spent part of the night when he was arrested there at the high priest's place. Joseph Caiaphas is a real guy. What am I trying to say? This myth that they say is such a myth is really soundly grounded in all kinds of really concrete, real stuff, real people, real places, real times. You know, that so if you read other ancient Near Eastern myths, not so. Not so. All right. So we already talked a little bit about Pontius Pilate. He replaced Valerius Gratus as procurator of Judea in AD 26. He stayed in that position amid numerous struggles from AD 26 to AD 36 when he was relieved of duty and sent to Rome. Pontius Pilate messed up several times unnecessarily with the Roman government. When he first came to Judea in AD 26, he brought all the statues and Roman images of the golden eagles and other things, maybe the Caesar's bust, I'm not sure, into Jerusalem among a group of people that are wildly against graven images, caused big riots. They hated his guts for doing that. A little bit later, he decided to build an aqueduct. And he decided that instead of using funds that would come out of his budget, he would rob the Jewish treasury, you know, the Korbanos, the Jewish treasury. So he robbed the Jewish treasury. There was such a riot, and they were all up in arms, and he sent his soldiers among the crowd with clubs under their coats, and when he gave the signal, they just killed and beat whole bunches of people to death. They hated his guts. Later on, there was another such incident a little while after Jesus' death, I think, and he killed a bunch of people, and finally they recalled him to Rome. And this puts the story of Jesus' crucifixion into perspective when he kept taunting the Jews and saying, look, here's your king. They hated him, he hated them. Shall I crucify your king? And they're going crazy, we have no king but Caesar. So all of this, is given even more credibility. This is Caesarea, which is Pilate's winter quarters, also the winter quarters of Festus, Felix, and Agrippa, if you go later on down into the time of the book of Acts. So during the life of Jesus, Pilate was hanging out here sometimes. During the life of Paul in the book of Acts, Pilate was gone, but Felix and Festus were here. Remember Felix that said, go thy way, and I'll call you when I have a more convenient season? Yeah, he was probably saying that to Paul right here in this palace where the weeds are now. And then that great scene in Acts 26 where Herod Agrippa, and all of his cohorts are inside of the palace, and Paul is preaching to all of them. And he says, King Agrippa, I know that you believe the prophets. And King Agrippa says, do you think with such a little bit of persuasion you're going to make me into a Christian? And Paul is looking around that big inside those pillars, and he says, I would to God, O King, that not only you, but all those others who are listening to me today should become what I am, except for these chains. See, all that happened right there. That's crazy, isn't it? It's concrete. It's concrete. All right, so let's push this a little bit further. I get going too much. Does anybody have a question you want to raise before we go past this? We're talking about historical references that support biblical facts, context, whatever. Sir. Oh, okay. Oh, you mean this palace right here? Yeah. So Caesarea, by the way, Caesar, the first part of it, Caesar, what does that spell? Caesar. So in the first century, it was pronounced with a k instead of a s. Caesarea. It was built by the Caesar Augustus, and it had that name. If you looked outside of this in other pictures, the whole port of Caesarea, the way the Romans, there's no question that this was Caesarea of the time of Jesus. Not any question at all. There's all kinds of mosaics there. There's all kinds of inscriptions there. It was definitely Caesarea, and it was definitely the government headquarters. If you, that's actually my weird looking back there with the blue shirt. If you looked out the direction I'm looking out towards a hippodrome, where they would drive the horses around and around. There's a hippodrome right out there, and it goes right where those people are standing in the background. That's looking out into the Mediterranean Sea. And there's absolutely no question that this is the actual real Caesarea. Okay? There's a Roman aqueduct that's been built from the Jewish mountains down to here. It's cool as all get out, but we don't have time to go into that, but that's a great question. And there's no question that the archaeological Jerusalem is the real Jerusalem. Bethlehem is the real Bethlehem. There's no question in anybody's mind that those are real places. Okay, now let's just cogitate on this a minute. Why should we believe all the external sources and not believe the biblical sources, which actually go back further even than the external sources? And so this is the oldest copy we have of the Gospel of John. It goes back to about AD 100. John was still alive in AD 100. Okay? This is one of the oldest copies of, that's the end of the Gospel of Luke, right at the top. That's the beginning of the Gospel of John right there. This is one of the Bodmer papyri, dates about AD 200, about 90 years after John's death. The Gospels. Everybody understood then that these were written by John, Luke, people that lived in the first century. And they tell the story of Jesus with all the dates and places and also with the miracles in them. It would be better for the postmodern view if they just told about miracles, but they weren't rooted in all this concreteness. But they're really deeply rooted in concreteness. See, that causes the tension and wait, this is different, this is weird. But here's what gives the postmodern philosophy difficulties. But the Gospels, even though they are first century sources, they make these weird claims. They say that there was this young woman, this virgin, in Bethlehem, and her name was Mary. In Nazareth, her name was Mary, and they went to Bethlehem, and Jesus was born there, and she was a virgin, never known a man. They do tell about the miracles of Jesus. They do say he died as planned by God for sin, and that he rose bodily from the dead. And they supply lists of witnesses who saw him after his death. But that's all supernatural. But it's grounded firmly in historical concreteness. So look at these here. And again, ask yourself this question. Why do I give more? I'm not saying I, but a lot of us in our culture, we give more credibility to outside sources than we give biblical documents. Why is that? Because we've been taught to question anything that is what? Supernatural. All right, so we're going to talk about Pliny to a minute. Pliny to Trajan is another Latin source. In the book of 1 Peter, the book of 1 Peter was written to Pontus and Bithynia and Cappadocia. Pliny the Younger was the governor of Bithynia, about 100 to 112 or 13 or 14, the governor of Bithynia. This is the province to which 1 Peter was written. Okay. Trajan was the emperor. You had Domitian, that's emperorship, ended in AD 96. Then real briefly, you had Nerva, part of 96 through 98. Then you had Trajan, and Trajan ruled from like 98 to 112 or somewhere in that age. I don't have it exactly, but it's roughly correct. So Pliny's correspondence to Trajan. You have Clement of Rome, who wrote in 96 AD. He's a Christian source. I've got the pagan sources in purple or blue, whatever it does, and the Christian sources in red. You've got Ignatius of Antioch in Syria. You've got Polycarp of Smyrna in Asia, who knew John when he was a child. You've got the Didache, which is an early Syrian Christian document. You've got Justin Martyr, who was writing to the emperor in about 165, 170 AD, explaining what Christians do everywhere. You've got Irenaeus of Lyons. You've got Tertullian, who lived in North Africa, and you've got Flavius Josephus. But all of those talk about Jesus, and they talk about Christ, and they corroborate things together. So it's not like there's not a lot of historical validation for a lot of these things. So are these really different? You've got the historical Jesus, which is as in the postmodern mentality, the one who actually lived. And they've got the Christ of faith, that would be the one who's in the Bible. Do these have to be different? See, I think they're the same, but I don't have the same assumptions to begin with that postmodern theology does. So you've already seen those. We're going to get to this. What motivated Christianity to start? Why is there Christianity? Why was it not stamped out since it was persecuted from the very beginning? Why did it persist when it had no military objective like Islam? What was it that those people hung on to so desperately, and still hang on to, you know? And the answer is that they absolutely must have believed it. Now, this is a fascinating piece of correspondence, and this is part of the letter of Pliny the Younger, the governor of Bithynia, to Trajan, the emperor. And it's in Latin, translated into English here. But this is what he says. I can read it better here. In the meantime, this is Pliny writing. In the meantime, this is the plan which I have adopted in the case of those Christians who have been brought before me. I ask them whether they are Christians, which was illegal to be. If they say yes, then I repeat the question the second time and a third time, warning them of the penalties involved. If they persist, I order them away to prison. For I do not doubt that, be their admitted crime what it may, their pertinacity, and that's a new word on me, and inflexible obstinacy surely ought to be punished. Why are these Christians so obstinate that they're willing to die? There were others, he said, who showed similar mad folly, whom I reserved to be sent to Rome as they were Roman citizens. Now, isn't that interesting? Who was it in the book of Acts that got beaten and said, I'm a Roman citizen, and then he appealed to Caesar? So this actually exactly confirms the law and the custom that you see in the book of Acts with Paul. So he said, others I couldn't just punish, but I had to send them to Rome as they were Roman citizens. There's a glare on this screen. That's why I'm looking different directions. Later, as is commonly the case, the mere fact of my entertaining the question led to a multiplying of accusations, and a variety of cases were brought before me. An anonymous pamphlet was issued containing a number of names of alleged Christians. Now, I'm thinking back to like 1 Peter 4:15, maybe. Let no man suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or a meddler in other men's affairs. But if any man should suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. That's from Peter writing to Bithynia. This is the governor of Bithynia. Is there corroboration in here for what we read in the book of 1 Peter, or no? Okay, there is, isn't there? All right, so he says, yeah. So people were trying to accuse other people. Then he says, those who denied that they were or ever had been Christians and called upon the gods with the usual formula, reciting the words after me, and those who offered incense and wine before your image, which I ordered to be brought forward for this purpose with the regular statues of the gods. Wait a minute here now. We read Revelation 13, verses 14 and 15 and 16. Read 2 Thessalonians 2, and you're going to find people being forced to worship the images of the emperor and all that kind of. Wait a minute here. You see what I'm saying? Okay? So on the one hand, they can put TikTok videos out there that are telling our kids it's all mythology, or that this, surely you're not going to believe in this, that, or the other. But they're not going to put anything like this on TikTok or on whatever sources because I think a lot of people who are struggling with their faith would be interested in this stuff as well as that stuff, don't you? Because I think most of those people are probably sincere and honest people, and this would be good for them to hear as well. All right, so another thing, this will probably be our last thing. Suetonius Tranquillus, who lived AD 69 through 122, he was another Roman historian, and he wrote a book called The Lives of the Caesars. Now, it's definitely rated R, maybe almost rated X. It's in Greek, but the Caesars were pedophiles, they were murderers, they were swindlers, they were the most immoral bunch of people you've ever seen in your entire life. And if you read Vita Caesare, The Lives of the Caesars, you're going to read about all that stuff. Okay? So anyway, it's divided up into chapters by the Caesars, the deified Augustus, the divine Claudius, like that. So in the life of Claudius 25:4, we have the statement, as the Jews were making constant disturbances, as at the instigation of Christ, he expelled them from Rome. This is talking about Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome. But if you read in Acts 18, verse 2, before Paul, met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Well, the edict of Claudius was in AD 49, and Claudius didn't die till AD 54. But in Acts 18, it talks about why Aquila and Priscilla had been thrown out of Rome because of the edict of Claudius. That was like it was on the news, It was real fresh there. But here we have it, outside and inside. So the issue becomes we have boom, 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 all this stuff, and we've just scratched the surface. Confirm, 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 confirm by outside sources. And then people say, well, it's just a myth. Let's go to church. Let's take a break and go to church, and we'll come back with this next time.